Hi guys, welcome to the second plant video. This one is specifically about different plant structures and how they work and why they're important. So I'm just going to start with a super basic kind of refresher of plant cells and the structures that they have that make them kind of unique. So I'll just label them here on this image. First of all, plants have a cell wall, and that's the thick green structure going around the outside. In plants, the cell wall is made of cellulose, which is what we also call plant fiber. Cellulose is a carbohydrate that your body is not able to digest because of the way the glucose molecules are arranged with one another, which is just kind of an interesting fact. It's also made of glucose, just like starch is made of glucose, but you can digest starch and not cellulose, just because of the chemistry of how they're bonded together. In the cell wall, there are gaps because the cell wall is rigid and strong, and so in order to get things in and out of the cell, there have to be holes in the cell wall, and those are what these little tunnels are going around. They're called plasmodesmata. And what these are, I'll underline this too, gaps in the cell wall. So materials can enter slash exit. Of course, for anything to enter and exit the cell, it has to pass through the plasma membrane, the cell membrane. So that's the orange line that's going around the whole cell. Plants have a cell wall, but they also still have a cell membrane. This is cell membrane. I'm not going to write a definition of that because I think everybody already is good on it. And then, of course, plants have this large central vacuole. Not every cell of the plant has a large central vacuole, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, but a lot of them do. So this is called the central vacuole. Hello. So the central vacuole is used to store water for the plant because water is necessary for photosynthesis. And then you also have, of course, in most plants, not all of them, but in a lot of them, you have chloroplasts, which are green because they contain the pigment chlorophyll, which is the main pigment that's used to do photosynthesis. There are other pigments that plants have that are yellowish or reddish, and those are the ones that come out in the fall because when it gets cold, the chlorophyll actually breaks down and degrades, and the other pigments become visible. But during like peak season, when plants are doing photosynthesis, the chlorophyll overpowers those other pigments, and you see the green. One other interesting thing about that is that chlorophyll is reflecting green light. And so that means that plants, if you just put them under a plain green light, actually can't do photosynthesis. They have to use a different wavelength color of light besides green because of chlorophyll's properties. But that's chloroplasts. We talked about them before. Plants also, of course, have mitochondria, which they're going to use to do cellular respiration. So plants make their own food, but then they also have to convert that food back into usable energy, ATP. So these do cell respiration. And then, of course, we talked in the last video about how plants are eukaryotic. They will have a nucleus that stores their genetic material because they are eukaryotic cells. Now, of course, plant cells have a lot of other structures that are not shown in this diagram. All the organelles that you've learned about before, they would be in there. And then different cells that have different functions will have different structures as well. So a root cell is not going to look the same or have the same structures as a leaf cell. This is just a very basic generalized plant cell, just to kind of show the structures. But every plant cell, based on its function, is going to look a little different and have slightly different structures. Okay, Now I'm going to kind of highlight three specific cell types that are found in plants. And their list is going across here in your OneNote. The first one is parenchyma. So parenchyma is actually the most common. These cells, it's and so kind of like the picture that we table. It's your like most basic plant cell type. They are able to, so they're going to have chloroplast. They are able to mitosis, so they can divide, and they'll be found in leaves, sometimes fruit, um, and their main jobs are to store water, starches, and oils, and then of course to produce those sugars for the plant using photosynthesis. So those are called parenchyma. Those are your most basic plant cell type. The second type is collenchyma. So these ones are going to have cell walls that vary in thickness. So some that are thinner and some that are thicker. These are typically found in younger plants or younger tissues. So like a sapling tree. And they're very flexible cells. So an example of this is this is kind of just a funny story that goes along with this, but young trees are very, very flexible, like a fresh sapling that just got planted or something like that. So one time, my mom actually, I was riding in a golf cart with her, and she accidentally like backed over a like young tree in the golf cart, and it just like sprung right back up because it's made of mostly these cells that are very flexible and aren't going to just like snap in half like you would snap a twig. So they're super flexible. You still shouldn't like drive over trees though to test it out. Don't do that. And then they also form long strands, which you can see in celery. So if you've ever like peeled apart a piece of celery, those long strands of cells that you can actually like peel off are collenchyma. And then the last cell type is called sclerenchyma. And these are going to be the strongest cell type. And they actually have two cell walls, which is what makes them the strongest. And the first one is going to be cellulose, just like the other cells. And the second one is going to be lignin, which goes around the outside of the cellulose cell wall. And this is super strong. They actually are able to, if the cell dies, the inside of the cell wall remains. So after cell dies, cell wall remains. And this is going to be the cell type that makes up vascular tissue like the xylem and the phloem. Also, it makes up the pits of fruit, like a peach pit, and the shells of nuts, and like trunks of trees or like woody stems. The really strong parts of the plant are made up of this cell type. So those are your three cell types. Again, this is just an overview. This is generalized. There are more cell types. There's more diversity. This is just three examples of the diversity of cell types that exist in plants. So going up from the cellular level, we're going to go to the tissue level. So over here. And cells are used to make up tissues. And that's also true in your body and in the body of animals, that your cells that are all similar types group together, and that makes up tissues. So in plants, 3 of the tissues that we're going to talk about are dermal, ground, and vascular. And then when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about vascular plants only, so not mosses. This is just for vascular plants, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So dermal tissue is the outer layer of the plant. This is going to include things like leaves and stems, outer layers. And that might sound familiar because you might know that your skin is called your epidermis. And you also have dermal layers. It's your skin, the outer layers of you. And then ground is going to be root tissues. So these ground tissue is not going to be doing photosynthesis. It's going to be more adapted to absorbing water and having a high surface area. And these cells are not going to be green because they don't have any chloroplasts, which if you've ever like looked at the roots of a plant, you know that they're not green. And then finally, the vascular tissue, which we talked about in our last video, is the xylem, which transports water, and the phloem, which transports sugars and nutrients. Those are just 3 tissue examples. And then once we've talked about tissues, you can start to talk about organs of plants, which include spores, seeds, flowers, and fruits. We're just going to talk about the reproductive structures. We'll talk about leaves in our next video when we talk specifically about transpiration, which is how plants are able to like remove carbon dioxide and also lose water that way. But we'll talk about leaves next time. Sorry for being very distracting. Okay, so reproductive structures. Spores are going to be the simplest. And they're going to have no food source or embryo, which is the offspring of the plant. And then they're also going to be easy for the plant to produce. So I'll say energetically easy to produce. Spores are used by mosses and ferns. Used by mosses and ferns in order to reproduce. And then seeds are a little more complex, so they're going to have a protective outer covering for plant embryo. They're going to have a food source for the embryo. And they're nice because a spore has to land in a favorable location in order for it to germinate and grow into a new plant, where a seed could land in a less favorable location and still survive because it does have that protective outer covering that the spore doesn't have. So it takes more energy for the plant to produce a seed, but overall it is beneficial and kind of worth the energy because of the protection that the baby plant will get. And this was in our last video, but a cotyledon is a embryonic leaf that is inside the seed. And this is kind of how you can tell the difference between a monocot and a dicot, because a monocot will only have one, and that's like a corn kernel. And a dicot will have 2, and that's like a apple seed. And if you ever like have pulled apart a apple seed or anything like that, you can actually kind of see that if you like peel the layers off and you take them apart, there's 2 halves to the apple seed, or like an orange seed, a lot of fruit seeds like that. And those are the embryonic leaves. So those are seeds and spores. Those are the difference. And then seeds are going to be used by angiosperms and gymnosperms, which are your pine trees. And the seeds of a gymnosperm will be in a pine cone instead of in a flower. All right, so another reproductive structure is a flower. And these are reproductive structures of angiosperms, flowering plants. They have both male and female parts. Which we'll label in just a second on a flower picture. The female parts are the pistil, which is the main part of the flower that extends upward. You can see it really well on like a lily. And then also the ovary, which will become the fruit, which is kind of crazy that when you eat a fruit, that's what you're eating, the ovary of the plant. And then also ovules inside the ovary, which are like another word for eggs almost. And they will become the seeds. The male part of the flower is called the stamen. And it includes pollen, or produces pollen rather, which is the sperm of the plant. So that's why it's important for like bees and other insects to pollinate the plants, because that's how plants actually are able to do sexual reproduction if they're flowering plants, by exchanging pollen from plant to plant. So the pistil of the flower, which let me just go over here to our picture. So the pistil is highlighted in light pink, and the pistil will be higher than the stamen. And the purpose of that is so that the stamen can't pollinate its own pistil, because you want to have genetic diversity, and how you get that is through pollination from a different plant. And so the pistil has these three parts. So this is the female part. The stigma is the top, and it's actually sticky. And it's sticky so that when an insect comes and brushes against it, it will, like the pollen that the insect is carrying will actually stick to the stigma. The style is a long tube that connects to the ovary, which contains ovules, which will become seeds. And eventually the petals will fall off the flower, the ovary will be left behind, and it will become the fruit. And then in the last video, we talked about that too, about how like fruits will be very different depending on how that plant specifically spreads its seeds. So they might not necessarily be like a super edible or delicious fruit if they are adapted to spread their seeds in a different way, maybe through water or through wind or through attaching to an animal's fur. They won't always be delicious. And then the stamen is the male part. The anther is the top that produces the pollen. And the filament is the long tube that attaches to the anther. Filament's not super important for our purposes. And then the purpose of the petals is to be attractive to pollinators. So these are things like bees, birds, butterflies. They're bright so that a pollinator will be attracted to it and will come there to pollinate the plant, because without it, the plant can't reproduce for the next generation. So that's flowers. Last structure we're going to talk about today is fruit, which we kind of already did. So the purpose of the fruit is to spread the seeds. There are many different ways it could do that. So it could do that through being eaten, because the seeds will have like a hard outer shell, they won't be digested. So this happens a lot with bears and like in certain berry species, but the bears will eat the berries and then the seeds will survive the digestive tract of the bear. And wherever the bear um, lets the seeds out is where they'll grow, hopefully in like a favorable condition, in a favorable location. They could also spread through water, like a coconut. So being eaten would be like a berry, or a lot of the fruits that we normally think of. Through wind, this will be like the helicopters that kind of rain down, or also through attaching to animals' fur and being transported that way, and that's like a sand spur. Yeah, so those are some examples of how fruit are able to spread seeds of the plant for reproduction. Um, we'll talk more about leaves next time. There are special structures too that plants have, and we'll talk about roots later on too, but I want to stop there for today. So you're doing great. Keep it up. Let me know if you have questions or if you need me for anything, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.